Hello there, welcome to my guide for painting the Orc Ninjas from Puppets of War. These miniatures can be used in Warhammer 40,000 and they are absolutely fantastic, especially if you're a fan of the very first thing I've done is sprayed them all with some matte white spray from Colourforge. You'll also notice that I'm also going to be painting the guys that go with the party wagon. I'm going to do that first before I paint the party wagon, as it'll be easier to glue them on after everything's finished. I'm going to start with their trousers, and to begin with, I'm going to use some Rakarth flesh. This will then be given a wash with some Army Painter Soft Tone. While that wash dries, I'm going to move on to the little Grot Splinter, and I'm going to paint his outfit with some Screamer Pink. I'll then give that a wash with a little bit of Nuln Oil. Once the wash is dried on the trousers, I'm going to go back and relayer the Rakarth flesh, taking care to avoid any of the recesses. Then to start painting the rest of the highlights, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Rakarth flesh and Wraithbone. I'm mostly going to be focusing on any areas where the light would naturally catch. You'll then get a second highlight, but this time it's going to be using that same mix, but at a 80-20 ratio in favour of Wraithbone. Moving back to the Grot version of Splinter, I'm going to dry brush on a 50-50 mix of Screamer Pink and Pink Horror for the first highlight. And then this will be followed by Pink Horror just by itself as a much lighter dry brush, just trying to pick out all those very fine details that he's covered in. Moving on to the skin and starting with Splinter, I'm going to be using some Auric flesh for him. So more often than not, most of the time the turtles actually have a different colour of green, so we're going to go with that technique. Starting with the Donatello, I'm going to be using some Deathworld Forest for his green. For the Raphael variant, I'm going to be using some Lauren Forest. I would come up with funny orky names, but I'm just not good at that. For the Leonardo variant, I'm going to be using some Elysian Green. And then finally, for the Mikey, I'm going to use some Skarsnik Green. He is going to be the lightest out of them all, but we are going to now tie all their skin colour slightly together with a wash. And that wash is some Athonian Camo Shade. Once the washes have dried, I'm going to go back to the Splinter, and I'm going to use the Auric flesh just to relayer everything, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. I'm then going to use a 50-50 mix of Auric flesh and matte white for the highlight. All these highlights on the skin are basically going to be where the light would catch them most. Moving over to Donatello, I'm going to relayer the Deathworld Forest once again, taking care to avoid any of the recesses. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Deathworld Forest and Elysian Green. For the next highlight, we're going to use that same mix, but at a 70-30 ratio in favour of Elysian Green. Then for the final highlight, it's just going to be Elysian Green all by itself, and this is basically on the very edges of the muscle structure. Once again, it's basically where the light would catch the most on the skin. Next, we're going to go to Raph, and we're going to relayer the Lauren Forest, taking care once again to avoid any of the recesses. Then we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Lauren Forest and Auric flesh for the highlight. And then for a second and final highlight, we're going to use that same mix, but at a 70-30 ratio. Once again, this is just aimed towards the areas where the light would catch the most. Moving on to Leonardo, we're going to use the Elysian Green to relayer the skin. Then we're going to use a 70-30 mix of matte white and Elysian Green for the highlight. Once again, we're going to use that same mix, but this time at a 50-50 ratio for a second and final highlight. Finally, on to Mikey. We're going to use some Skarsnik Green just to relayer all that skin, taking care to avoid any of the recesses. For the highlight, it's just going to be one highlight this time. It's going to be a 50-50 mix of Skarsnik Green and Matte White. With the skin out of the way, I'm going to move on to the gloves, and for that I'm going to start with a base coat of Abaddon Black. The first highlight for the black will be using Corvus Black. And the second will be using some Eshin Grey. This is mostly just an edge highlight and sort of tickling the tips, really. Then for any sort of padded armor, apart from the stuff that's on their wrists, I want to paint that a different color. I'm going to be using some Catachan flesh. And as my camera decides to focus on the background, I use Nuln Oil to wash all of that Catachan flesh. Once our wash is dried, I'm then going to use a 50-50 mix of Catachan flesh and Knight's Quest flesh to start the highlighting. I'll then do a second highlight, but this time it's just an edge highlight, and it'll be using Knight's Quest flesh just by itself. Then we're going to start painting their socks, and for that I'm going to start with a base coat of Grey Seer. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and Matte White. And then lastly, Matte White just by itself for the final highlight. I'm then going to start painting the insides of their mouths, and for that I'm going to use some Screamer Pink. And I'll wash the insides with some Carroburg Crimson. While that wash dries, I'm going to start painting all of their straps that they're surrounded in, plus the handles or the wraps around their weapons, and for this I'm going to be using some Wraithbone. And I'll give it a wash with some Army Painter Softtone. Once that wash is dried, we're just going to simply relayer the Wraithbone by using an edge highlight, making sure we avoid those recesses and the center lines. We've got a little bit of shading. As I'm getting closer to painting the bandanas, I'm going to use some Matte White to paint their eyes. Then I'll be using a 50-50 mix of Screamer Pink and Matte White to start highlighting the inside of their mouths. Followed by that same mix, but at a 70-30 ratio in favor of Matte White. Finally, we're going to start adding some bright colors to make these guys pop and to make them look more like the turtles. So I'm going to start with Michelangelo, and we're going to use some Troll Slayer Orange for the base coat. There's also a couple of other points that I'm going to pick out, as well as the bandana and the belt. I'm also going to pick out some of the armor that's on the hands, just to have a little bit more color on the model. I'll then give all of that a wash with some Fugan Orange. Then I'm going to move over to Leonardo and use some Teclis Blue. That will get washed with some Dragunov Nightshade. Raphael will have some Fiston Red to paint all of the red areas. This will also get washed, but this time we're going to be using some Carroburg Crimson. Then finally, for the base coats, Donatello will be using some Zerus Purple. And they'll also get washed with some Druchii Violet. We're going to go back to Mikey now the wash is dried, and we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Fire Dragon Bright and Troll Slayer Orange for the first highlight. This will then be followed by Fire Dragon Bright just by itself. And then finally, for the last highlight, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Fire Dragon Bright and Matte White just for an edge highlight and just to pick out those sort of small details. Moving over to Leonardo, we're going to relayer the Teclis Blue, but we're going to make sure we avoid any of the recesses, so that way we can keep hold of our lovely shading. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Teclis Blue and Lothan Blue. And then finally, Lothan Blue just by itself for a final edge highlight. Moving on to Wrath, we're going to relayer the Mephiston Red. Once again, we're going to take care to avoid any of the recesses. Then we're going to move on to Evil Sun's Scarlet. And then finally a 50-50 mix of Evil Sun's Scarlet and Wild Rider Red. Moving back to Donatello, we're going to relayer the Zerus Purple, once again taking care to avoid any of the recesses. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Zerus Purple and Gene Sealer Purple. And then finally an edge highlight of Gene Sealer Purple just by itself. Next, I'm going to move over to their teeth, and I'm going to be using some Morghast Bone. I'm also going to use it to paint the connecting points, or the little ropes that are joining all their armor together. Then both the teeth and those little ropes will receive a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. I tried thinking about what color I wanted to paint Michelangelo's skateboard, and in the end, red ones go faster, so red it is. I started with a base coat of Mephiston Red. Then followed that up with some Evil Sun's Scarlet. And then finally some Wild Rider Red. For the wheels, I'm going to paint them a nice yellow using some Avalanche Sunset. And that will receive a wash with some Cassandora Yellow. Once the wash on the teeth have dried, and just the teeth, I'm not going to be painting the ropes. I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Morghast Bone and Wraithbone to start the highlighting. And then I'm going to use Wraithbone just to paint the tips of the teeth. To paint any metal weaponry, I'm going to use some Lead Belcher. And that will receive a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. And for Donnie's weapon, I'm going to use some Dryad Bark. Then I'm going to use some Gothel Brown just to highlight the edges with a little bit of a quick dry brush. And once the wash on the metal is dried, I'm also going to use some Stormhouse Silver just to give the edges of that a quick dry brush as well. Then finally going back to Splinter, I'm going to use a little bit of Evil Sun's Scarlet to paint his eyes. Then I'm going to use some Grey Seer to paint his facial hair, which I'll then wash with some Nuln Oil. With the painting out of the way, I'm going to move on to the bases, and the bases for my guys are going to be nice and simple. It's just going to be a little bit of Astro Granite to match in with the rest of my orcs. Once that's dried, I'll give that a quick dry brush with some Grey Seer. Then finally, I'll neaten up the bases by painting the edge of the rims with some Abaddon Black. There we are, that's the TMNT Orks from Puppets of War finished. And I've got to say, they're an absolute blast. I still have the party wagon to paint, but I'm going to paint that in a different video. This one's starting to get a little bit too long. Unlike these guys, however, they didn't take too long whatsoever. They only took around about 8 hours to paint all of them, but then I was doubling this up as I was also painting the ones that came with the party wagon. And if you want to follow that guide for the party wagon when that's finished, please give the channel a subscribe, the video a like and a share, and comment below if you've actually picked up these models, if you've bought anything from Puppets of War. They're a fantastic miniature, and well, I hope you had as much fun painting them as I did, and I hope you've been encouraged to actually pick these up, because they are absolutely gorgeous models. All I have to say is goodbye for now, so I'll say that, goodbye for now.